He bought back his father's farm. What I found under the barn changed everything. The hammer hit hollow wood. 6 feet down, something weighted in oiled cloth. A metal box with my own name carved deep into the surface. Inside, pressed against aged leather, a deed transfer dated 6 months before my father supposedly lost everything to gambling debts. Transfer price, $1. But if he didn't lose the farm, why did he give it away for practically nothing? The Holloway Ranch stretched across 800 acres in the shadow of the Sangre Mountains. 15 years I'd saved every penny, working cattle drives from Texas to Montana, all to buy back what had belonged to my family for 3 generations. The previous owner, railroad man Morrison, finally agreed to sell after his wife passed last spring. $42,000 for land my grandfather cleared with his bare hands. The document in my trembling fingers told a different story entirely. Midday sun blazed through the barn's open doors as I sat on the dirt floor, the metal box warm against my palms despite 20 years underground. The smell of old oil and leather rose from the contents. My horse ranger stood tied to the corral fence, occasionally stamping against the packed earth, but something about the box made him nervous. He kept his distance. I read the deed transfer again, my calloused fingers tracing each line of my father's careful handwriting. Thomas Holloway to Harold Morrison, 800 acres, $1, not gambling debts, not business failures, a choice that made no sense unless something had forced his hand in the winter of 1878. My mother died believing her husband was a broken man who'd lost everything to cards and whiskey. The whole town whispered the same story for 2 decades, but this document said Thomas Holloway had made a deliberate decision, not suffered a defeat. What could force a man to give away everything he loved? The box contained other items wrapped in separate pieces of cloth, a photograph of a woman I didn't recognize, wearing a silver brooch that seemed familiar, a letter bearing the territorial government seal, the wax still unbroken after all these years, and something else that made my hands shake as I unwrapped it carefully. But as I lifted the final object, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the valley. Fast riders, coming hard from the direction of town. After 20 years of buried secrets, someone else knew exactly what I'd found, and they were coming to make sure it stayed buried forever. I shoved the documents back into the metal box, heart hammering as the hoofbeats grew louder. 2 riders crested the hill beyond the main gate, silhouettes sharp against the clear blue sky. The lead horse was a chestnut mare with white markings that belonged to Elena Vasquez, whose family owned the neighboring spread, but the second rider sat rigid in his saddle, like a man accustomed to giving orders. Elena dismounted near the barn entrance, dark hair escaping from beneath her hat. She'd grown up alongside me, and her father had been one of the few men who never believed the stories about Thomas Holloway's gambling debts. Now she approached with an expression that made my stomach clench. The stranger remained mounted, pale eyes that never blinked scanning the barn interior. He wore a black coat despite the warm noon air, and a silver badge caught the harsh sunlight from his vest pocket. Everything about him suggested authority, the kind that could make problems disappear. Elena stopped 3 feet away, her gaze dropping to the metal box in my hands. She'd always been direct, but now she seemed to choose her words with unusual care. The silence stretched until the stranger cleared his throat and dismounted. Garrett Holloway. His voice carried the flat accent of someone from back east. Name's Deputy Marshal Crawford. I believe you found something that doesn't belong to you. The words hit like a physical blow. This federal lawman somehow knew about the buried box, knew I'd discovered it today, knew enough to ride straight here with Elena as his guide. Whatever my father had done 20 years ago had attracted attention from people with long memories and official authority. Elena's jaw was set hard, but her eyes held an apology she couldn't speak aloud. Dust still drifted down from the barn rafters where I'd been hammering. Crawford stepped closer, his boot crushing the fresh dirt I'd excavated, his hand resting on his revolver grip. Garrett, Elena said quietly, we need to talk about your father, about what really happened in 1878. Crawford moved another step closer. That box contains evidence in a federal investigation that was never officially closed. Evidence that certain parties have been eager to recover for 2 decades. I felt the weight of the metal box in my hands, felt the terrible significance of whatever secrets it contained. My father had buried this evidence for a reason, had taken that reason to his grave, had somehow kept it hidden, even when losing everything he'd built. But now they'd found it again. The deputy marshal's next words carried absolute authority. Question is, Mr. Holloway, are you going to cooperate voluntarily, Or do we need to explore other options? Elena stepped between me and Crawford, her hand moving toward the rifle hanging from her saddle. You gave me your word nobody would get hurt if I brought you here. Crawford's smile held no warmth. That depends entirely on Mr. Holloway's willingness to be reasonable. I stood slowly, keeping the metal box pressed against my chest. Every instinct screamed run, but Crawford's horse was fresh while Ranger had been working all day. Besides, running would only confirm whatever suspicions had brought federal authority here after 20 years. What kind of investigation? I asked. What could my father have done? Crawford removed a folded document from his coat pocket, paper bearing official seals. But instead of answering, I opened the box again and pulled out the photograph of the unknown woman. Elena's breath caught. That's my great-aunt Maria, she whispered. She died in 1879. How did your father have her picture? I unwrapped another item from the box. A hand-drawn map showing railroad routes through the territory, with pencil marks indicating land purchases months before the official announcements. Crawford's face went pale when he saw it. Your father witnessed something that winter, Crawford said, his voice tight. Something involving railroad contracts and territorial land grants. Elena studied the map over my shoulder. Those markings show Morrison buying mineral rights along the proposed route. But the route wasn't announced until spring. I pulled out a stack of receipts bound with string. Purchase agreements for grazing leases, all dated 6 months before the Denver Pacific expansion became public knowledge. All signed by Harold Morrison and 3 other railroad officials. They had advance knowledge, I said, understanding flooding through me. They bought land rights for pennies, then sold them back to the railroad for enormous profits. Crawford nodded grimly. Your father discovered the scheme. Morrison and his partners made millions from information that was supposed to remain confidential for 50 years. Elena's face had gone hard. My father always said there was something corrupt about how quickly Morrison acquired acreage. He wasn't wrong. I felt the weight of understanding settle on my shoulders. My father hadn't lost the ranch to gambling. Thomas Holloway had been silenced by men with enough power to destroy anyone who threatened their illegal profits. The deed transfer for $1 hadn't been a sale at all. Morrison threatened him, I said. Threatened his family if he talked. Crawford's expression grew darker. Your father had a choice. Keep quiet and lose his land, or speak up and lose his life. Morrison made sure he understood the difference. Elena moved closer to me. That's why he buried the evidence instead of destroying it. He was protecting you and your mother, but he wanted someone to find the truth eventually. Crawford extended his hand toward the box. Which brings us to the current problem. Those documents represent evidence of federal crimes that powerful people assumed were buried forever. People who've spent 20 years building careers on stolen money. His next words carried absolute authority. People who would rather see that evidence destroyed than allow it to surface. And that desire extends to anyone who might have read those documents. My grip tightened on the metal box as Crawford's implications sank in. He wasn't here to deliver justice for my father's suffering. He was here to make sure the evidence disappeared permanently, along with anyone who'd seen it. Elena must have reached the same conclusion, because her hand moved openly to her rifle stock. You're not here officially, are you? This isn't about justice. Crawford's facade began to crack, revealing something dangerous underneath. Miss Vasquez, I'd strongly advise you not to interfere. But Elena stepped closer to me, presenting a united front. These men destroyed the Holloway family for profit. They forced Thomas to choose between his land and his life, then let everyone believe he was a gambling fool. Crawford's hand moved toward his weapon, but I stepped forward before violence could explode. What's in the letter from the territorial government? What else did my father find? The question caught Crawford off guard. For a moment, his composure slipped entirely. You haven't read everything yet. I opened the box again, removing the sealed letter bearing official stamps. The wax seal had remained intact for 20 years, protected by the oiled cloth. Inside, written on territorial letterhead, was communication that made my hands shake as I read aloud. Investigation into suspected irregularities in the Denver Pacific Railway expansion contracts. Agent Thomas Holloway authorized to gather evidence of corruption among territorial officials and railroad executives. Report to be filed directly with the governor's office upon completion. Elena's breath caught. Your father wasn't just a witness. He was working for the territorial government. He was an undercover investigator. The revelation changed everything we thought we knew about Thomas Holloway's final months. He hadn't stumbled across corruption by accident. He'd been deliberately gathering proof of criminal activity at the highest levels. Men who believed their secrets were safe had been systematically exposed by a man they dismissed as a simple rancher. Crawford's face had gone ashen in the harsh noon light. That letter was supposed to have been destroyed. Governor Palmer assured us no copies existed. The admission confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. This deputy marshal wasn't working for the federal government at all. He was working for the same men who destroyed my father 20 years ago. My father completed his investigation, I said. That's why they had to silence him. He had enough evidence to bring down Morrison and everyone involved. Elena moved to stand beside me. And now they want to finish what they started. Crawford drew his revolver, metal gleaming in the sunlight. I tried to make this easy. Some situations require more direct solutions. He gestured toward Ranger with the barrel. Nice horse you got in that pen there. The mistake was subtle, but Elena caught it immediately. That's a corral, not a pen. Any man from this territory would know the difference. Crawford's confident expression wavered as the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the valley again. But this time they came from multiple directions, surrounding the ranch. He wasn't in control anymore. Someone else had been watching, waiting for exactly this moment to make their move. Dust clouds rose from the north, south and west as riders appeared on the ridgelines around us. Crawford spun in a circle, his revolver useless against what was clearly a coordinated effort. The riders who surrounded us weren't strangers. As they descended from the ridgelines, I recognized faces from town, men who had worked the ranches and mines for decades. At their head rode Sheriff Marcus Kane, his weathered face grim beneath the brim of his hat. Behind him came Elena's father, Diego Vasquez, and 3 other ranchers whose families had lost land during the railroad expansion. Crawford's revolver wavered as he realized his situation had shifted completely. Sheriff Kane, this is federal business. You have no jurisdiction here. Kane dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his own weapon. Funny thing about federal business, Crawford. I sent a telegram to Denver yesterday asking about you. Seems there's no Deputy Marshal Crawford currently assigned to this territory. Elena's face lit with understanding. You've been watching him. Her father nodded grimly. Ever since he arrived in town 3 days ago asking questions about the Holloway Ranch. We've been waiting 20 years for someone to come looking for that evidence. I felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. You all knew what my father was doing? Diego Vasquez stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Crawford. Your father wasn't working alone, son. Half the ranchers in this valley were feeding him information about Morrison's land purchases. We all knew something corrupt was happening, but we needed proof. Sheriff Kane moved closer to Crawford, who was slowly backing toward his horse. Thomas Holloway gathered evidence for 6 months before Morrison discovered what he was doing. When your father disappeared that winter, we knew they'd silenced him somehow. Crawford's mask of authority had completely cracked. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. You people don't understand what you're interfering with. This goes all the way to the territorial capital. We know exactly how far it goes, Kane replied coldly. That's why we've been waiting for the right moment to act. Elena moved beside me, her rifle now openly trained on Crawford. When he came to our ranch asking about Garrett buying back the property, we knew the evidence had to be hidden somewhere on the land. We've been waiting to see what you'd find. I looked around at the circle of men who had surrounded us. Understanding dawning. You've all been protecting my family's secret for 20 years. Diego nodded. Your father died protecting information that could destroy some very powerful men. Men who've gotten rich and influential by stealing from the territorial government and the people who live here. Crawford made a sudden move toward his horse, but Sheriff Kane's voice stopped him cold. I wouldn't do that if I were you. These men have been waiting 2 decades for justice. Some of them lost everything when Morrison and his partners manipulated the railroad contracts. The false deputy marshal turned slowly, his pale eyes calculating the odds of escape against 6 armed men on fresh horses. His shoulders sagged as he realized the futility of his position. Kane extended his hand toward me. That box contains evidence of federal crimes. Garrett, evidence that needs to reach the right people in Denver, not the corrupt officials who've been covering this up. I looked down at the metal box in my hands, feeling the weight of 20 years of injustice and my father's sacrifice. But one question still burned in my mind, and I needed the answer before turning over everything my father had died to protect. What did Morrison threaten my father with? I asked. The question that had been burning in my chest since I first read the deed transfer. What could force a man to give up everything for $1? The silence that followed stretched taut as piano wire. Sheriff Kane and Diego Vasquez exchanged a look that held 20 years of painful secrets. Elena moved closer to me, her shoulder brushing mine as she positioned herself protectively between me and Crawford. Elena's father finally spoke, his voice heavy with old grief. "Your mother. Garrett, Morrison threatened to kill your mother and make it look like an accident." The words hit me like a physical blow. Elena's hand found mine, her fingers warm and steady against my palm. "But she died of fever 2 years later." Kane's jaw tightened. "Did she? Or did Morrison decide that Thomas had outlived his usefulness after transferring the land?" Crawford laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the barn walls. "You people still don't understand. This isn't about one railroad contract or one corrupt official. Harold Morrison was just the beginning." Elena's grip on my hand tightened as the implications sank in. My mother hadn't died of natural causes. She'd been murdered by the same men who had destroyed my father's life and stolen our family's legacy. I felt Elena's strength flowing into me, grounding me when the revelation threatened to overwhelm everything I thought I knew. "Tell him the rest," Crawford said mockingly. "Tell him about the other families. Tell him how deep this corruption really goes." Elena stepped forward, her voice carrying steel I'd never heard before. "My family lost water rights to those same men. My great-aunt Maria died trying to expose what they were doing." She pulled the photograph from the metal box, pointing to the silver brooch. "This was hers. She gave it to your father as proof of their connection before Morrison's men silenced her too." Understanding flooded through me. Elena's family hadn't just been protecting my father's secret. They'd been fighting the same battle, losing their own people to the same corrupt network. Diego's face had gone hard with old anger. Morrison wasn't acting alone. He had partners in the territorial government, men who controlled mining permits and water access rights throughout the region. They used advance information to buy up valuable claims before the surveys became public. I opened the metal box again, pulling out the final item I hadn't yet examined. Elena helped me unwrap the small leather journal filled with my father's careful handwriting. As we read together, her breath warm against my neck, names and dates spilled across the pages. "This is why they had to kill him," Elena said softly, understanding flooding her voice. "He didn't just have evidence of Morrison's crimes. He had documentation of the entire network." Crawford's confidence began returning as he saw the scope of what we were holding. That journal names territorial officials, federal appointees, and railroad executives, who are now some of the most powerful men in Colorado and Wyoming. Elena read over my shoulder, her closeness both comforting and distracting. "Senator Walsh is in here, and Judge Morrison." She looked up at me, her dark eyes reflecting both sorrow and determination. "Your father was braver than any of us knew." Crawford straightened, sensing our growing understanding of the impossible odds we faced. "Even if you take that evidence to Denver, who do you think will receive it? Who do you think controls the federal prosecutors and territorial judges?" Elena's voice was steady when she spoke, but I could feel the slight tremor in her hand as it rested on my arm. "There is another option. These men are willing to be generous to people who understand the reality of the situation." The offer hung in the air between us, and I realized Elena was testing me, wanting to see what kind of man I truly was. This was the same choice my father had faced 20 years ago, and she was watching to see if I had inherited his courage or would choose the easier path. The same choice my father had faced 20 years ago: take the money and stay silent, or fight a system designed to crush anyone who opposed it. Elena's eyes searched mine, and I saw something deeper than friendship there. Something that had been growing between us since childhood, but had never been spoken aloud. "What kind of generous offer?" I asked, surprising everyone, including Elena. Her hand tightened on my arm, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she moved closer, presenting a united front. Whatever decision I made, she was making it with me. Crawford's eyes lit with predatory interest as he reached into his coat pocket, producing a leather pouch that clinked with gold coins. $5,000, more than enough for 2 people to start fresh somewhere else. The way he said it made clear he'd noticed the connection between Elena and me. Sheriff Kane's face darkened with disgust, but Elena stepped forward before he could speak. "You think money can erase 20 years of injustice?" Her voice carried a fury that made even Crawford take a step back. "You think we'd take blood money from the men who murdered innocent families?" I realized then that Elena wasn't just supporting me. She was fighting her own battle, seeking justice for her great-aunt Maria and everyone else who had suffered under Morrison's network. Crawford tried to regain control. Miss Vasquez, surely you understand the practical realities. Your families have already lost everything once. Why lose everything again fighting a battle you cannot win? Elena's laugh was sharp as a blade. Because some things are worth more than safety, worth more than money. She looked at me, her dark eyes blazing with conviction. My father taught me that a person's character is defined by what they do when nobody's watching and everything's at stake. I felt something shift between us in that moment, a recognition that transcended the danger we faced. And my father taught me that some fights are worth having even if you lose. Crawford's confidence wavered as he realized we weren't going to be bought or intimidated. You're making a mistake. Both of you. I opened the metal box again, pulling out my father's journal. Elena moved to stand beside me, her shoulder pressed against mine as we faced Crawford together. You're right about one thing. My father was too idealistic. Crawford's smile returned as he thought I was capitulating. But Elena caught on to what I was really saying, and her own smile was fierce with understanding. He was too idealistic to realize that sometimes justice requires making sure the right people receive evidence, Elena continued for me. Sometimes it requires having partners you can trust completely. I held up a page from the journal showing a detailed map. My father didn't just document the corruption. He made copies. 3 complete sets of documents, hidden in different locations throughout the territory. Elena's eyes widened with genuine surprise and admiration. The photograph of my great-aunt. She wasn't random. She was a message about where one set was hidden. Diego Vasquez stepped forward, pride evident in his voice. Maria worked for the Territorial Surveyor's Office. She had access to official documentation that could corroborate Thomas's evidence. Crawford's face went ashen. That's impossible. We searched everywhere. Elena's hand found mine again, her fingers intertwining with mine as we faced down the man who represented everything our families had fought against. Not everywhere. You never thought to look in places where people like Maria and Thomas had allies. I squeezed Elena's hand, drawing strength from her unwavering support. Those copies are already in the hands of federal prosecutors in 3 different territories. Men who aren't part of your network. Crawford's hand moved toward his weapon, but 6 rifles swung toward him. Elena's was among them, her aim steady and sure. His shoulders sagged as he realized he was completely outmatched. Your entire network is about to collapse, Elena said with quiet satisfaction, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Sheriff Kane moved swiftly, his handcuffs clicking around Crawford's wrists before the false deputy could react. Crawford, or whatever your real name is, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. Crawford struggled against the restraints, his composure finally shattered completely. You people have no idea what you've started. This network has tentacles reaching into every territory from here to California. Elena stepped closer to me, her hand still intertwined with mine. Then it's time to cut off those tentacles, she said with quiet determination. I walked to where rangers stood tied to the corral fence, reaching into my saddlebags to pull out a wrapped package. Elena watched with growing amazement as I unwrapped 3 identical copies of my father's documentation, each set carefully preserved and sealed. The evidence was never just in the box, I explained, turning to face her directly. My father was thorough. Before he died, he made sure copies reached people he trusted outside the territory. I've been carrying confirmation letters from federal prosecutors in San Francisco, Denver, and St. Louis for the past 2 weeks. Elena's eyes sparkled with admiration and something deeper. You've known about the evidence all along? I shook my head, stepping closer to her. Not the details, but when I bought back the ranch, the lawyer in Denver gave me a sealed envelope that my father had left with instructions to deliver it only when I took possession of the land. Inside were those letters and a map showing where to dig. Diego Vasquez stared at us both with growing understanding. You've been planning this together. Elena looked up at me, her dark eyes reflecting the same realization. Not together, but we've been fighting the same battle our whole lives without knowing it. Sheriff Kane secured Crawford to his saddle, then turned back to us. The federal investigation has already begun? 3 weeks ago, I confirmed, but my attention was focused on Elena. Morrison was arrested in Denver yesterday morning. Judge Morrison and Senator Walsh received federal warrants this morning. By sunset, the entire network will be in custody or fleeing to Mexico. Elena's eyes filled with tears of relief and justice. Your father's sacrifice wasn't in vain. Neither was my great-aunt's. I looked down at our joined hands, then back to her face. They both fought for something bigger than themselves, for the idea that good people shouldn't have to live in fear of corruption and greed. As Sheriff Kane prepared to leave with Crawford, Elena and I found ourselves alone beside the barn, where this had all started. The metal box sat open between us, its secrets finally revealed, and its power to destroy families finally broken. "What will you do now?" Elena asked softly. "You have your father's land back, but you also have the truth about how you lost it." I looked across the 800 acres that 3 generations of Holloways had called home, then back to the woman who had stood beside me through the most dangerous day of my life. "I'm going to stay, but not alone." Elena's breath caught, understanding dawning in her expression. "Garrett, my father built this place for my mother," I said, moving closer to her. "I want to rebuild it for the woman I love. If she'll have me." Elena's answer came not in words, but in the way she rose on her toes to meet my kiss, her arms sliding around my neck as 20 years of friendship transformed into something deeper and more precious. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard. Elena smiled against my lips. "I've been waiting for you to figure that out since we were children." "Well," I said, pulling her closer, "I was always a little slow when it came to the important things." As the sun moved toward the western mountains, we stood together looking across land that would now be ours to share. The past had finally been laid to rest, justice had been served, and the future spread before us like an open road. Elena leaned against my shoulder, her fingers still intertwined with mine. "Your father would be proud of what you did today." "What we did," I corrected, knowing that without her courage and support, I might have taken Crawford's offer and run. "We make a good team." She looked up at me with eyes full of love and mischief. "Think we can handle building a life together?" I kissed her forehead, tasting the salt of her earlier tears and the sweetness of our shared future. "With you beside me, I think we can handle anything." The Holloway Ranch would continue, but now it would be the foundation for something new. A partnership built on love, trust, and the hard-won knowledge that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where love and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.